Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast, broadcasting here from Happy Valley, where we are under 48 hours away from another top 10 showdown here in Beaver Stadium. Michigan Wolverines ranked third in the college football playoff rankings, unbeaten on the season and unbeaten in Big Ten play since October 2021. Rolling to town, looking to extend that win streak amid a lot of noise around that program right now. And meanwhile, Penn State just 3 weeks removed from that loss to Ohio State that stung for a while. Perhaps it still does. They'll get a shot of redemption back on home turf, and to bring in Daniel Gowan and Mark Brennan for better perspective on this whole deal right now. We heard from Zach Shaw on our Tuesday podcast. He gave us a really good breakdown of where the Wolverines are right now. We didn't really tiptoe around the situation. He told us where he thinks the locker room is as the investigation goes on, as we wonder if Jim Harbaugh is going to be on the sideline Saturday even. It's a wild week for coverage here. But at the end of the day, it's 60 minutes of football that will determine who is really in a good position for the college football playoff, or if the chaos is going to be the theme of the season here in the Big Ten. Mark, we'll begin with you because, again, we've seen this before. It's an opportunity for James Franklin and this program to ascend, take the next step. And as we've said, the Big Ten East coming to a close, that era of football. It's been maybe the best division in football for 5 years or so now. The SEC West has had a contention there. But you look at where this is now. It's the last shot. If you don't take care of business, it's 0-6 in a 3-year span against Ohio State and Michigan. And the one win that you got to go back to was in an empty big house in Ann Arbor during the pandemic-shortened season in 2020. So a lot on the line, because it feels like if they don't pick up this victory, even an 11-2 finish at whatever pick your bowl destination and a great New Year's Six matchup, it will still feel a little bit hollow, or perhaps not quite up to that 11-win season last year because of what the expectations were coming into August and because of what is riding on the line when the Wolverines or the Buckeyes share the field with this squad.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting because yesterday, as we record this Thursday, yesterday being Wednesday, Keandre Lambert-Smith was asked about, having never beaten Michigan, and he had to refresh a reporter's memory and said, well, yeah, I was there during the COVID year, but I think that's how far that's kind of slipped from everybody's collective consciousness. But I'm going to go back to something that I've been saying all week, and I really do think, it's not reported, but I don't think people are putting nearly enough emphasis on this. The fact that, again, as we record this Thursday, we're still waiting to hear if there will be any punishment or whatever. If you're a Penn State fan, you don't want any of that to happen until next week. You want to get the best version of Michigan that you can possibly get. So if you are able to win, if you are able to break this drought, as Daniel said earlier, there's no asterisk next to it. So it is, I think from Penn State's perspective, you want Harbaugh to be there. You don't want anything looming over this team's head. You want to play the best version of Michigan that you could possibly play. So if you are fortunate enough to win, that nobody is going to look at that, any other way than you beat Michigan. But yeah, absolutely. I think for the first, 5 or 6 years of James Franklin's, even a little bit more of his tenure at Penn State, you could rationalize the fact that they weren't able to beat these top 10 Big Ten teams. I think that's actually a better way of looking at it, because when they've played top teams in the Big Ten that are in the top 10, there were years where Michigan was down a little bit, but you could rationalize not being able to beat them consistently because of what he inherited, because of the way he had to rebuild everything, because of the way he had to get everything up to that elite level where they're able to compete. But now I think all those things are there. They have the facilities, they keep improving them. They certainly have a big enough staff, right? I mean, I did the player arrival, last week at Maryland, or at the team hotel, and then I shot over 5 minutes of video of people walking into the hotel. It was unbelievable. I've never seen anything like it. You have the athletes, you have the depth, you have all of these things, and I think that's what hurt fans so much when they weren't able to finally get it done against Ohio State. But this is your opportunity. And if you're able to get it done, then you are a bona fide college football playoff contender. And if you're not, you're what you have been the past however many years, the COVID years, not really counting in that. People may want to count those, but to me, I don't count those, because I think the whole world was kind of turned on its head. But you look at where Penn State was going into COVID and then coming out, it's a New Year's Six team. And if you're unable to get past Michigan this week, that's what you are. Is there anything wrong with that? Not necessarily, but if you want to say you're competing for national championships, you haven't been able to do it.
And again, last year, where just 4 teams are invited to the party to determine who takes that crown. So it's the reality of the situation here in November 2023. It's the Big Ten East, and it's that 14 playoff, and for one more go round. Daniel, you do a far better job than I. I tend to get tunnel vision with Penn State football. You do a much better job than me keeping your finger on the pulse of the national college football landscape, maybe how things are viewed a little more externally for Penn State versus Michigan, and then we're viewing it here in the vacuum of being in Happy Valley. What do you get for the sense of the showcase that's developing here for Saturday, the sideshow circus act that's obviously intertwined with the whole process, and what Penn State stands to gain or lose from this opportunity in Beaver Stadium?
I think that from everything that I've read and been looking at, you kind of have to dig in a little bit to get the real analysis of the game because of the sideshow and everything else that's going on. Just like Mark echoed about wanting to see Michigan at full strength. I still maintain that you don't want anything to happen because you don't want an even more motivated Michigan team coming in based on how they've handled things earlier this year with Harbaugh's absence. I saw some things today about players posting photos that said "Free Connor Stallions" on Instagram. So you can kind of see that there's a huge us against the world thing that I think that is in Michigan, and you got to give Jim Harbaugh some props for being able to really foster that. I mean, that's what you do as a coach, get these guys in a position to win games. But I mean, I think that Penn State really does need to prove itself on the national level. I think that a lot of people view them as a very, very good program, maybe a great program with what they've been able to do recruiting wise, the talent on the roster, their showings against some of these inferior teams in the Big Ten and nationally. But I think that there's a lot of people that are still kind of waiting for that breakthrough, and then they're not viewed on the same level as Michigan, Ohio State, and then some of those SEC teams. So I think that Penn State stands to gain a lot from this game. If they can pull out a victory, I think that it would be the real signature win. I think depending on how the rest of the season goes, you might even be able to put it above 2016 Ohio State, depending on what happens these next couple of weeks if Penn State were to win. But I think that from that 100,000 foot view of everything, that Penn State is in a position where it can take a really big step forward. And I think that what we talked about before the Ohio State game, what we've touched on this week in terms of this era of college football ending, I think that even Michigan State had success over this past decade. Michigan and Ohio State have been up there. I think that if Penn State goes this stretch of the Big Ten East and 14 college football playoff without kind of having that breakthrough, I think that you can view at least this slice as, from that perspective, as some sort of disappointment, some level of disappointment. But it's interesting though, because this Michigan stuff has really snowballed, and it takes a little bit. You have to dig down a little bit to get to the matchup, to even get to Penn State.
Yeah, I mean, look, you talk about Franklin winning that title in 16, and it was a surprise. They didn't get into the playoffs because they had those 2 early losses, but it accelerated the expectations so much nationally, certainly here locally, because you consider where the expectations were and where people were realistically talking about Penn State being part of any title conversation when he came here in 2014 or when Bill O'Brien took over in 2012. It felt like a long way off, and all of a sudden you're hoisting that trophy in 2016. We're suddenly 7 years removed from that. And like you said, we've seen different teams pop up. Michigan State got annihilated on the college football playoff stage, but they were on that stage. And I think you're right. If history, when we look back at this era of college football, whatever it is, about a decade sample size of how the college football playoff was structured and how teams won national championships, it's going to be a short list that Penn State is on of the also-rans, of the teams that were on that bubble. And that's just a frustrating spot to be. Maybe it's a better spot than people thought that Penn State would be in 2014, but it's not quite where where kind of the trajectory was set and established a long time ago. And because of these two teams that you're sharing a division with, that's a huge part of it. Mark, I mean, we got to go back a long ways to the last time we covered Penn State losing a game that didn't involve Ohio State or Michigan. It's the Arkansas matchup in the Outback Bowl. And you want to talk about a completely different team and a much different staff. I mean, it doesn't look very similar in so many ways. And yet, as much as they've been defined by the Rose Bowl run and this resurgence of talent and the freshmen who stepped up last year, now they're sophomore players, and there's this nucleus of young talent that they can grow with, it's still also somewhat defined by the bitter moments that followed these defeats against Michigan and Ohio State, 2 of them against Ohio State now. And Mark, what do you make of this team's mentality? I think in the Ohio State week, we felt a bit more bravado, maybe a bit more outward, external confidence, public confidence, and perhaps that led some of us to go all in and say this is a game they're going to win. I was about as confident as I ever remembered a Penn State team being. They brought maybe their most complete defensive performance that we've seen from them in the last couple of years on the road to Columbus, and probably their worst offensive performance in the last few years on the road to Columbus. They got a 20-12 loss out of that. What do you make of what we've heard, what we've encountered this week here leading up to the Michigan matchup?
Well, they're saying all the right things, but they always say all the right things, right? I mean, I think the more telling thing was last week's game against Maryland. You know, there was the expected hangover against Indiana. I don't think many of us thought it was going to be to the extent that it was, and that it actually impacted the defense as well. You know, and for the first time all season, the defense didn't play particularly well. But I think the fact that Penn State was able to come back against Maryland, a very athletic Maryland team, you know, obviously a Maryland team that's struggling, but to not only win easily, but to regain some of that swagger that we saw earlier in the year. And, you know, maybe you don't like the personal foul penalties. Maybe you don't like Katron Allen flexing and that stuff, but I think they needed that. I mean, I think that was a team that just it had to refine the pop in its step, and I think it did that. Now, will that carry over into Michigan? I think going into the game, they're going to have that. Now, we'll see what happens once the game starts. But I think the way that this schedule played out, that the fact that they were able to kind of survive that Indiana game and then come out with a kind of clear head and just really annihilate Maryland, I think that was a positive for Penn State. And again, from what we hear this week, everybody's saying the right things again. I mean, I like the fact that Kalen King was like, yeah, this game means a little bit extra. I mean, we all know, and other players are not saying that, but I actually like the fact, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. When you're in game week, okay, you can give us this 1-0 stuff the entire season, and I have no problem with that because it seems to work for them, right? But once you're in a game week, get rid of that stuff and admit that, yeah, this is a big game. Everybody's watching. Everybody's going to judge you. This is going to be a much different game. If you beat this team, it's going to be much different than if you beat Maryland or Rutgers. I mean, those teams with no football tradition whatsoever, you're playing against Michigan. Sorry, guys. But
it would be different than beating Utah in the Rose Bowl.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially given the history, the recent history. And as you said, Tyler, the fact that this is the end of divisional play, and then the fact that next year you could be the number 12 team or the number 11 team, I guess, technically speaking, and still make your way into the college football playoff. So yeah, this is huge, and we're seeing the right things. And I think we actually saw it from the defense and special teams at Ohio State too. We just didn't see it from the offense.
Yeah.
So I think that's where all the vision should be. I think the defense is going to play well. The special teams, I think, has been that's another undervalued part of this. They came out of the bye week. I mean, they went into the bye week with so many questions on special teams, and they have tightened all those things up. So you're going you have a pretty good feel that you're going to get a good performance from your defense. The special teams has proven that it's been consistent week in and week out recently. So where is that swagger going to be from the offense? Are we going to see it, or are we not going to see it? And that's where I think when we're making predictions on this game, that's where everybody's like thinking, this could be an uphill climb.
Kalen King on Wednesday did call this a confirmed statement game.
There you go. Yeah.
And then at least one other person on this roster went out there publicly and did it. His twin, Kobe King. A few hours later, we caught up with him after practice, and he said, yeah, definitely a statement game. The quote that I'll read from him here, it definitely means more for everybody, I would say. Got to come out with a chip on our shoulder, and this is a game that we feel like is going to help us in the near future. We've got to take advantage of it. There's been some read between the lines comments, and that one stood out. There's been some others this week. I think they've been sold that they win this game, that they're in the driver's seat to get to the college football playoff. I don't know if they've been told that directly, but they're basically saying if you handle your business here, you are in control of your destiny to go chase a national championship. And how many teams can reach mid-November and actually be behind the wheel? Now, is that really the case? I don't know. There's such a convoluted conversation, and you're going to have maybe a couple other teams to deal with in your division, even if you beat Michigan, let alone all the other teams across other conferences. But Daniel, what are you thinking here? I mean, the way that they're approaching this Michigan game, it looks like Chop Robinson and Mean Vanover. Certainly we're back at practice. We'll see if that means they're back in the game. This is a healthy team for mid-November. They've got depth in a lot of places. What do you think they are, just overall body of work heading into week 10, game 10, and as we'd probably say, the biggest matchup of 2023?
I thought Mark made a really good point about how confident they sounded before the Ohio State game. And I think that it's not necessarily that kind of same bravado this week, but I think that, like you laid out with those quotes from Kalen King and Kobe King, that there's a certain level of almost honesty when it comes to what this game means for Penn State. I think that, we talked to Kalen King, Kobe King, and Jalen Reed, all of whom are from Detroit, Michigan guys. Kalen King told us yesterday about how he estimates he went to 15 Michigan games growing up. He loved the Wolverines. We already knew that Charles Woodson was his favorite player. He said that Michigan was a place that he really could have seen himself through the recruiting process and everything. And I think that Kalen King is he's one of those players where he's at a certain level in terms of his confidence, what he can say, how he says it. He's a very polished speaker and things like that. But I think that we saw like a little bit of a window into this team being kind of loose this week, and having kind of a quiet confidence through acknowledging this. I mean, talking to these guys from Michigan compared to talking to all the guys from Maryland last week. I mean, last week, talking to those guys from Maryland, it was kind of like, it's going to be cool to see my family, but this doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, I'm from Maryland, and the Terps also reside there.
Exactly. But, Kalen King kind of acknowledging it. Talking to Jalen Reed, we talked to him on Wednesday night for a long time, just about growing up in Detroit, knowing the King twins, playing against them in high school and Little League. Talking about the guys that came before him, like Sauce Gardner, that he has a close relationship and who've helped him. Getting kind of that insight from him into kind of what surrounds this. And, he talked about that he's going to know a lot of guys on the other side. And that's something that's, pretty cool to him. And I think to hear that acknowledged, and it's just kind of a very honest approach. I think that the team, kind of like you said, I mean, I think they know what the implications of this game are.
Yeah.
I think that James Franklin, he always preaches the 1-0 thing, but the caveat that he always adds onto it is that part of that message is still, if you do this every week, then we're going to reach our goals. And we heard some of these guys in the spring, I think Jalen Reed in particular, laid out what those goals are, and that's national championship. So I think that these guys know what they're playing for, and they know that despite all of this 1-0 and one game at a time, they still know what the ultimate goal is. I think that James Franklin has done a really, really good job of communicating how you get there, and that you can't do it all in week 6 or week 8 or something like that. But I think that hearing from the King twins and Jalen Reed and some of the other players this week, even last week after the Maryland game, Olu Fashanu said that November is the month of champions, which is something that I haven't heard a Penn State player say that in my short time, and kind of framing it what's happening like this. So I think that this team is geared up for this game and what comes after it, because I think that's also part of it too, that they know is that if you get by this, there's still 2 more games. There's still stuff you have to do. But I think that, the body of work, if you add Michigan to it, it speaks for itself. And I think these players know that. And I think that they were a little bit more honest about that this week than maybe we usually hear.
And I have no doubt that those 20 days that are going to separate them from the Sunday morning that followed the loss against Ohio State were enough to recharge the emotional batteries. We certainly saw pretty empty batteries against Indiana. They were much more back to what we anticipated from the team against Maryland and really taking a step forward there. I'm expecting them to be emotionally raw, and whatever comes to this matchup, they're going to feel it in a big way come the next Sunday morning, win or loss. And they have a couple more games to get to, as Daniel mentioned. Getting into some of the details of this game, as I mentioned, Chop Robinson and Amin Vanover, we saw them on the practice field. We'll see what things look like pregame in Beaver Stadium. Be big to get them back on board. Robinson, 3 sacks, 5 tackles for loss over the first course of this matchup of the season before being sidelined at Ohio State. Many have projected him as a potential first-round pick, and then Amin Vanover has been really that number 4 defensive end, but he's missed 4 games now on the season, so Zariah Fisher has been stepping up, and Nittany Lions, the true freshman, has burned red shirt. But when we look at the wide receiver position, no sign of Harrison Wallace. So that continues to put focus elsewhere. And Dante Cephas obviously brought the spotlight upon himself, marked down in College Park, a couple touchdowns, 6 catches after not recording more than 2 receptions, after not reaching 40 yards in any of his previous 8 games as a Nittany Lion. We covered a lot of ground on this on Monday, but this is vital at wide receiver. This can't be an outlier at Maryland, in my opinion, if they want to match up against Michigan and really take this one down to the wire. It cannot be a situation where we're talking after the game about Keandre Lambert-Smith having 8 catches on 12 targets, and you've got to go down to the next wide receiver having 1 or 2 catches on 3 or 4 targets. And this discussion after the game is guys need to finish their routes. Maybe if we get there, maybe we don't, but Dante Cephas is going to get a lot of run to kind of shape that narrative.
Yeah, well, that was the question when he was coming from Kent State, right? It's like, yes, this guy showed that he can do it against a Big Ten opponent or a Pac-12 opponent, on a kind of a one-off basis. But can you do it stacking games? Can you do it week in and week out? And I said it earlier in the week. I thought it was impressive that Cephas got an opportunity early in the year and really kind of fell flat, didn't get the job done, but had enough confidence in himself to kind of circle back around. And then when the opportunity presents itself against Maryland, he was able to get it done. But absolutely, because I think but at this point, you have a pretty good feeling of what you're going to get from Keandre Lambert-Smith. And you have a pretty good feeling now what you're going to get from those 3 tight ends. I mean, all 3 of those guys, you have to throw Dinkins in there now, even though he doesn't have the volume. The key catches that guy's making, whether it's touchdowns or first downs, I mean, that's a guy that they're very comfortable with. So obviously they're going to stick with their 12 personnel because that's what's working for them. And that means that you need another wide receiver to step up and get it done consistently. And it sure looks like Cephas is that guy. But again, doing it against Maryland is one thing. I mean, doing it against Michigan is a completely different beast. So there is, I don't want to say there's a lot of pressure on him, but there's a lot of pressure on him. So there, I just said it. I mean, he's going to step up and get the job done, because I just don't know that there's anybody else in that room that you could really lean on that has showed us that they're ready to do it. I keep saying, I'd love to see Caden Saunders get more of a chance, and they ran him out there a few times against Maryland, but didn't really look in his direction all that much. And Liam Clifford looks like they're putting him out there basically as a run blocker at this point. Like he goes in and they run running plays. So Malik McClain, he seems to be playing, but they don't really go to him that much. So Cephas, this is a big game for Dante Cephas, and I think could really take a lot of pressure off of everybody else in the passing game.
About a big game for this running back tandem. It's not too late to reverse course and show the country that you are among the elite. We know Katron Allen has been gaining some steam, and it's been more of a sputtering for Nick Singleton of late and for much of this season. But these two will be in the spotlight, backing up Drew Aller at quarterback, his first time going against this Michigan defense. And you look at what these guys have done or really not been able to do in a couple of the bigger matchups in their career thus far in national stages. Obviously, the Rose Bowl, they delivered in a big way. But you think about the Ohio State game, they were largely non-factors after early portions of that game. Singleton got loose a little bit early on, but I believe that the total was 80 yards on 20 touches combined for them against Ohio State in that matchup. And they really didn't play a role with touches as that game got late in Columbus. And then you look back to last year in a game that really got away from Penn State in the second half against Michigan, and the offensive possessions felt very few and far between and very short for the Nittany Lions. But you had 6 carries for 16 yards for Katron Allen last year against Michigan, and Nick Singleton last year in Ann Arbor goes 6 carries for 19 yards. So 2 of the bigger games where eyes are on this team and eyes are on these backs hasn't really been the star power involved there. So Daniel, we have heard a lot about Katron Allen this week. Again, if we go with the rotation, it's going to be Nick Singleton starting. So keep an eye on that in Beaver Stadium. If Katron Allen gets a start, that bucks a little bit of a trend of going one guy, then the other. Regardless, it feels like James Franklin pretty much opened up about it after practice. This is a game because of the physicality and brutality that we expect in Michigan versus Penn State, where Katron Allen, his profile just matches up with what's at stake. And he told us on Wednesday that he is not going to back down from the moment.
I would be surprised if he did back down from the moment. I mean, I think that Katron Allen is someone, from what we've learned about him these past 2 years and how he approaches things, he wants the ball in his hands and he wants to make things happen. And he believes that when he has the ball in his hands, that he's going to make things happen. I think that it's interesting when you look at how last year's game against Michigan went, and you talk about that Ohio State game earlier this year in terms of not getting touches for these guys. And I think that that's where, if you're Penn State, you just have to figure out how to stay on the field so that you can get into these rhythms. I mean, that Ohio State game, they got away from the run, but they also didn't really get the chance to really get anything going with all of those 3 and outs that they had. And last year at Michigan, you're playing a game that is really just slipping away from you in that second half. I think 27-3 run that Michigan closed that game on, or something along those lines. So I think that, if you're Penn State, that really goes to kind of the game control and trying to be able to dictate the terms of the game on how you want to do that. And I think Katron Allen is someone that is that type of running back in terms of how physical he is. He's always falling forward, always getting extra yardage. And I think that he's someone that can help keep Penn State on the field. And if you're on the field more, it gives you more opportunities to do things on offense. So I think that that's kind of what, when I look at this running game, and in order for it to be successful, they're going to need Drew Aller in the passing game to pick them up. They're going to need those wide receivers and tight ends that, if they have the opportunity to move the chains, or even get them into a 2nd and short or 3rd and short, they're going to need that part of the game to really step up to give them chances to have success. So I think that Katron Allen is someone who can really play a big role with how physical he is. And then with Nick Singleton, I think that we talked about after the Ohio State game that Singleton is supposed to be one of those guys that's an equalizer, that traditionally Penn State wasn't recruiting on the same level as Ohio State in terms of 5 stars. And Nick Singleton is someone who's supposed to help level the playing field a little bit, the type of guy that can really change a game in one play. So I think that we've seen a little bit on those kickoff returns that Nick Singleton still has that juice, still can make some things happen with a full head of steam. But I think that if there's any time for him to make that happen on offense, this is really it in that running game.
You think about how this matchup went in the last few years. The trenches were so important to this team, and the offensive line here again, front and center, a prove it moment. We heard from Phil Trautwein, the offensive line coach, here on a Thursday morning. He sounded confident that his group is going to be able to, in his terms, out physical Michigan, and that's, if we see Penn State on their offensive front out physical this Michigan defensive front, they're going to win this game. I think unless they make some major mistakes or have defensive lapses, that would change the complexion of this matchup. And that's just not the kind of performance, Mark Brennan, that we have historically seen against the Michigan, against Ohio State, over and over in these series. 7 sacks surrendered a couple of years ago in a very narrow loss in Beaver Stadium. Last year, they weren't able to run the ball. Everything that they did on the ground essentially came from a Sean Clifford scramble, it felt like, and a lot of punts involved along the way. This is a moment for them. A good step forward against Maryland. They are as deep as we've ever seen this offensive line at this stage of the season. That has maintained throughout. They got JB Nelson back. That rotation is back on board. But here it is again. Put up or shut up kind of. And I think the fan base, again, they get to 11-2 even. But if what they see from the offensive line against Ohio State and Michigan is a stalemate or getting driven back or miscommunication, then that's going to be ultimately how a lot of folks are going to remember the 2023 version of the offensive line, fair or not.
Yeah, I mean, it almost sounds like Trout is trying to speak it into existence, right? I mean, have we seen any indication that this team is going to, out physical people in the running game? I don't know. I mean, I guess we saw it on Katron Allen's touchdown run against a thoroughly defeated Maryland team at that point where the entire pile moved. But this is the classic example of where we are with this team. It's like, yeah, I got to see it to believe it. I mean, you have Nick Singleton. If you look at his Big Ten only stats, and they've played the worst rushing defenses in the Big Ten, he's averaging 3.5 yards per carry against Big Ten opponents. I mean, that's not good. And that's not
3 yards. It's about 3 yards lower than his average against Big Ten opponents last year. It's jarring. I mean, to be where we are now with Thanksgiving around the corner and the numbers reflecting that way, it's difficult. And you know how much it must be crushing Nick Singleton himself on a week-to-week basis.
Right, but as much of a reflection as it is on him, it's an equal reflection on the offensive line, the tight ends, and the receivers. I mean, it's a group effort. I mean, he's been this close. How many times have we heard that? Yeah, I've been this close. I mean, that was a line I was going with early in the year. He was this close to breaking this. He was this close to breaking that. And sure, I don't think there's a little bit something missing there. I don't know if it's his vision or if it's just the way he's feeling things or whatever. But that doesn't explain 3.5 yards per carry. Again, when you've played the worst rushing defenses in the Big Ten, when you're talking about Northwestern, Illinois, and who else was in there? There was Indiana, So I appreciate Phil saying that. And I love the way that Phil has come along as such a thorough, he's able to explain things in a way that human beings can understand, like normal human beings, not offensive line, geeks, which I respect offensive line geeks, but there's so many complicated things there. And again, a lot of reporters think they're coaches, but we're really not. So I always appreciate when an actual coach can explain things to us in ways that we understand. Having said that, I mean, they'll prove me wrong if they're able to go out and physically dominate Michigan. And I will be the first one to stand up and say, you know what? I absolutely got that wrong. I'll do it in my report card. I'll give myself an F, but I'm going to believe that when I see it.
Yeah, and I don't think dominance should be the goal here, but you should set that as your goal, of course. But I think in terms of what's realistically in play here, what you'd like to see is a push, because just a push hasn't really necessarily been there. Consistent push, because you got to set yourself up with manageable third down situations. If you're getting contact in the backfield, first, second down, that's going to derail those ambitions. We haven't seen Nick Singleton go it about himself to break a bunch of tackles and escape the backfield. Katron Allen can maybe do that and turn a 2-yard loss into a 2-yard gain, but you're still looking at a 2nd and 8. So with that said, setting the stage for Drew Aller, manageable third downs, I would put very high on the list. And for him to have the backing of a ground game, something that for whatever reason, you can look at Ohio State's defensive approach in the second half. You can look at the play calling for Penn State's approach. They decided not to equip Drew Aller. It was determined not to play call it, to equip him with a ground game or to really try to force the initiative with the ground game at Ohio State. That patience word that James Franklin keeps referencing. He mentioned it about the Iowa game. He talked about maybe the lack of patience, that slipping away against Ohio State. To me, I'm reading that into it's okay to get 4-yard gains. It's okay to keep getting 3-4-yard gains and find yourself and constantly needing to move the chains on third down. That's kind of work. I mean, that's what they did against Iowa, right? It felt like they were just constantly at 3rd and 2. I mean, that's what they were for the first 6 games for the most part. It was just working your way to 3rd and manageable. And along the way against Ohio State, that just did not happen. They started 0-15, and we know the rest. So, Daniel, when it comes to Drew Aller, we heard from him on Tuesday. You documented that conversation at Lions247.com. He's back in the spotlight. He's riding the high of his first game. But a lot of people will tell you that Drew Aller doesn't ride highs. He doesn't ride lows. He just is Drew Aller. And fair or not, I'll say it again, his sophomore campaign and how people are going to view him, not going to be so much based on the stats. They're very pretty right now. 23 total touchdowns, 1 interception. But the nation got a long look at him when he went to Columbus, and he didn't look like the number 1 quarterback prospect in America. And he acknowledged that afterwards. Here he gets a shot at redemption, and he's kind of being tasked with leading this offense because of the way the ground game has gone through 9 games.
I think when you talk about the stats being pretty too, and Drew being judged by the results on the field, I also think that up until the Indiana game and when he hit Keandre Lambert-Smith at the end, what was his kind of signature throw through the first,
The
6
first Keandre Lambert touchdown on the first possession of the first game, I'd say.
Exactly. And now you look over these past 2 games and you have the pass to Keandre Lambert-Smith, you have the 2 touchdowns to Dante Cephas, you've got that pass to Tyler Warren for the touchdown, and you can even put the 38-yard gain to Keandre Lambert-Smith early in that game, and even that Theo Johnson touchdown, because it was Aller basically improvising when the trick play went awry. So I think that we're starting to see, or we did see something different from Drew Aller. I think one thing that stood out to me a little bit, I was going back and watching parts of that Maryland game on the DVR, and I thought that Brock Heward brought up something that we haven't really heard from Drew Aller before, and that Brock Heward said that Drew Aller told him that he wanted to rip it against Maryland. And I think that
Kind of sounds like Chuck It, doesn't it? Sounds a
it
little
might.
bit like Chuck It.
But I think to me, ripping it is that throw to Tyler Warren through a couple defenders. I think chucking it, I think that's throwing it up for grabs. I'm gonna put a delineation there.
I
But
couldn't help myself.
Easy.
Man.
You're gonna have somebody going after you on Twitter.
oh God. But no, I just think that we've seen a little bit of that mindset change, and to hear that kind of communicated along through that way, I think that it shows an element of relaxation, of confidence in Drew Aller. Personally, I attribute it to hitting on that touchdown pass to Keandre Lambert-Smith, not the interception. But it's clear that he at least has potentially turned some kind of corner, that something really has clicked for him. He said that after the Maryland game. I think that that's something to really keep an eye on, is just what throws is he making? What throws are Mike Yurcich and James Franklin letting him attempt in terms of what they're calling? How are his receivers picking him up and keeping things moving? I think that things are kind of coming together, that you are starting to see a little bit more of the offense that we thought we would. Of course, you're trying to do this against maybe the toughest defense you'll play all year. At the same time, the Michigan defense maybe hasn't seen an offense like Penn State's yet. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. But I think that everything that Drew Aller tells us about his personality, everything that his teammates tell us in terms of not really being able to tell if he's up or down, because that's just how he always is. I think that anytime you can get some sort of insight into what he feels through someone like through a TV analyst, or pretty much anyone, I think that it's illuminating, and I think that it shows that maybe Drew Aller is kind of coming into his own a little bit. Maybe they are letting him. Maybe he does feel comfortable enough to take these throws, and it's happening at a good time.
After a couple of late October Saturdays where he was, had the look of angst on his face quite a bit in Beaver Stadium for the Indiana game, and the week prior at Columbus, smiles all around for Drew Aller down in College Park. In fact, there was something that was asked about in the press conference was just his demeanor and that smile. And listeners out there, watchers out there, close your eyes, give yourself a second. Imagine Drew Aller walking off the field, smiling, ringing that bell after the game on Saturday afternoon, and what that would mean for Penn State and for him, fulfilling so much of what you could call a prophecy with a 5-star quarterback prospect. Does it happen this Saturday? Is it something that ultimately proves to be motivating for him in Penn State moving forward because it doesn't work out to fruition? We'll find out in a matter of time, but a lot on the table for Drew Aller and what his sophomore season is going to be remembered as. The defensive front here, the other topic we got to get to before we talk players to watch in our final predictions. We talked about a lot of players to watch already, of course, but Mark, the defensive front has heard about this game for a long time. The linebacker group, the defensive tackles, of course, have been bludgeoned with that 418 number, the total rushing yards they gave up last year in Ann Arbor when they got boat raced on the ground by the Wolverines. Here's their opportunity. James Franklin discussed this week. Not only are they deeper at defensive tackle on the defensive line, but they are bigger. You can see the physical difference. We noted it in the spring. We noted it again in the preseason camp. And now we have seen it show up in a big way. The linebackers, James Franklin alluded to, they are more experienced. They are more physically impressive than they were last year. And you look across the room and you look at the stats and you look at the opportunities they've gotten on the field. Yeah, that's all exactly right. But here we go. You're taking on a very impressive Michigan team, and yet not quite as impressive on the ground as they were last year, not with the authority. Blake Corum leads all of college football with 16 rushing touchdowns, but you're kind of seeing a parallel situation play out with Donovan Edwards, a former 5-star running back. He's kind of sputtering on the ground. He's really made an impact as a receiver. That's a matchup to watch on the outside with him. But Mark, even if it's not the great ground game that Michigan brought to the final stretch of 2022, this is a great opportunity to exercise some demons for Penn State's defensive front and to set this team up to pull off the upset.
Yeah, I have a suspicion that after 55 weeks of chewing on that 471 yards, that they are not going to let them rush for anything remotely close to that. They may lose this game. Michigan with JJ McCarthy, a really good quarterback, very versatile quarterback, may beat them with the passing game. McCarthy may get some things done with his legs, but I do not. I would whatever the over under is on rushing for Michigan, I would take the under because I just to me. James Franklin pretty much called out his own team after that game, and he's walked that back to an extent, but not everybody walked it back. I mean, people are still talking about it to this day. So I have to believe, just knowing, what Manny Diaz is all about, having gotten to know him a little bit, and knowing the kind of intensity that a Dion Barnes brings, and knowing the way some of these defensive linemen and linebackers are wired, that to me, I can't imagine that they are going to allow anything remotely close to what happened. Now, again, I preface that, or I'll preface that by saying that I'm not expecting them to completely shut down the Michigan offense. There's too many good weapons, receivers, quarterback. But I have to imagine that if there's one statement they're going to make in this game, it's going to be that nobody's going to rush the ball against him that way again. And if Michigan is able to do it, congratulations to Michigan. This defensive line and the linebacker core isn't what I thought it is, but I think this is a pretty good group. The key to me is we're assuming that Chop and Amin Vanover are going to be back, and that gives you just an outstanding group of defensive ends. But I think their depth at defensive tackle, you don't have that one person who's like PJ Mustipher, who just seems to be better than everybody else. I think they can go so deep there with so many different styles of players, and you have some bigger bodies. You have some 300-plus pounders now. So I think the depth at defensive tackle is really going to be a key to everything they attempt to do defensively. And I would also say this, that we know how good the Penn State defensive backs are in run support. These guys are not afraid to come up and pop people. And so it wouldn't surprise me if they're going to err on the side of not being beaten by the running game. Maybe you do give up a long pass or two, but I think ultimately at the end of the day, we almost saw a little bit of it against Maryland. Maybe you sacrifice some things against the passing game to make sure that this team doesn't run, because I think that will put you in a better position to win the game, to win the time of possession battle, all of those things.
I know in Ann Arbor they do. That's kind of a concern that's brewing behind the scenes. There's other concerns right now in Ann Arbor, but I know that this rushing attack, they're wondering now that it's time to show up here in November, and they've got Ohio State in a few weeks and Penn State now, will that ground game show up? They had 240 yards average rushing last year on their way to a Big Ten title. This season, they're under 170 yards, so 70 fewer rushing yards per contest right now. That's actually a few yards lower than Penn State, fourth in the Big Ten. Meanwhile, Penn State, you want to talk about responding to a public challenge from your coach? They lead all of FBS right now in rushing yards surrendered per game, 60 yards allowed on the ground per contest through 9 weeks. So something's got to get figured out here. You look at that matchup and you think it favors Penn State, and then you remember what happened last year, and you've got to kind of marry those two things. And I think right now, fellas, if we're looking at the interior of the trenches, and that's really where this game could be determined, I give quite a benefit of the doubt right now to the defense, and I'm just having a hard time finding it for the offense. And That's just kind of, I guess that is really attributed to what we saw against Ohio State, but I think overall just a 9-game sample size. Let's finish with the other quarterback. We heard about him from Zach Shaw early in the week, but to me, this could be a separating factor on Saturday. Obviously, if they decide to take Jim Harbaugh off the sideline and his coordinators off the sideline, forget a lot of what we just said, and we'll have an emergency podcast perhaps. But when it comes to what we know now, JJ McCarthy, like you talk about him only 4 pass attempts or 4 pass completions on the season. This defense hasn't had to play late. Doesn't everything about them sound like what we were discussing with Penn State before the Ohio State matchup? You've been a heavy favorite in every game. You've taken care of your business. Where's the ground game? It's not quite what we expected. The defenders aren't having to play late. JJ McCarthy's on the sideline watching the final 4 or 5 possessions each week. What does it look like when the lights come on? The thing that's different, though, is Penn State was working with Drew Aller and a lot of pieces here that haven't had that spotlight opportunity. And Daniel, JJ McCarthy was the spearhead of this offense. I know the ground game really led it, but he was the orchestrator, the maestro for Michigan's offense as they went to the college football playoff. And he's here back again as the catalyst of a locker room. He is a really important figure here because not only what he can do with his legs, with his arm, but he is a central figure for this squad, and they've dealt with a lot of noise. They've dealt with a lot of drama. It has been present throughout his career as a former 5-star prospect, and he seems to be a guy who, for whatever reason, can weather that storm and help keep the team on track. You can't say that for every quarterback, and coming into the buzzsaw that I expect Beaver Stadium to be, I'd imagine they're going to be booed as loud as we've ever heard an opponent booed in Beaver Stadium. This is a really, really important thing for Michigan to be able to travel with JJ McCarthy as their quarterback.
Yeah, I wouldn't wish emergency pods on anyone at this point in the week. I mean, we're 48 hours away. I'm trying to get to Saturday at this point.
We got a basketball game to cover on Friday, man.
Exactly. But no, I think you look at JJ McCarthy and he's been really, really good this year. I think you drew a lot of parallels between Penn State going into that Ohio State game and Michigan coming into this game in terms of what they've done late, not being tested, etc. But we were talking to Kalen King yesterday, and Kalen King brought up the fact that Michigan is one of the most explosive offenses in the country, that JJ McCarthy has been really getting it done through the air with those wide receivers. That's not something we were seeing from Penn State through that first 6 games going into that Ohio State game. So I think that this Michigan offense is really clicking. I think JJ McCarthy is a huge part of it. Kalen King brought up the point that he thinks that the offense that Penn State will see on Saturday is going to be, pretty much the opposite of what they saw last year in Ann Arbor in terms of the struggles that the run game is having, the success that they've been having through the air. Kalen King talked about how that reputation kind of precedes Michigan in terms of being a smash mouth team. But he pretty much said that if you're expecting Michigan to come in and run the ball 40 or 50 times, that you haven't really been watching Michigan this year and the type of team they are. And I think that that's what happens when you have a quarterback who's playing at a high level like JJ McCarthy is. And he's been through it. He's quarterbacked a team to a pair of Big Ten titles. He beat out Cade McNamara, I guess technically quarterback that 2021 one. But he beat out a quarterback that had success, and then he came in and elevated things last year and into this year. So I think that JJ McCarthy is going to give Penn State a really, really big challenge. And we talked to Kalen King yesterday too about that Ohio State game and going up against Marvin Harrison Jr. Kalen King acknowledged that it's probably one of the worst games of his career. And he kind of said everybody saw it too. But the one thing that he took away from it was that he couldn't let that performance affect him down the stretch this year. And I think that he's a guy that we've gotten to know him and we know his mentality and his confidence, that I don't think it will. So you look at Kalen King, you look at Daquan Hardy, you look at Johnny Dixon in the safety room. These are all guys that are really going to have to be on their game against JJ McCarthy. That there isn't a Marvin Harrison Jr. type, but there's a JJ McCarthy type at quarterback. I'd take him over Kyle McCord right now, I think. And so you look at that and it's going to present a really, really stiff challenge. I wouldn't be surprised if we get to Saturday night and we're talking about this game and the Penn State run defense doesn't even really come up that much. That's kind of off to the side, maybe something we touch on and just kind of going through stars of the game, like Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards. I think that this Penn State pass defense is really going to have to step up, and I think it might be a good matchup for Penn State. So I'm really excited to see JJ McCarthy, and if he can validate this hype, if he can validate this performance, and it's going to be fun.
And hey, one stat could I throw out there, Tyler? And I was just looking it up now. I mean, the thing about McCarthy, you look at 75% of his 75.7 completion rate. That's crazy. But look back at last week as I knock my microphone over, and Talia Tungavailoa, 74% completion rate. Now, I'm not comparing those two teams, but I think you may see that same kind of approach where they allow some dinks and dunks with the passing game, but still focus on shutting down that running game as much as you can. We saw that you can be successful doing that. Michigan's a much different team, but just because somebody's completing a high percentage of their passes doesn't mean that necessarily translates into a massive outburst of points. And I think that may be a little bit of what we see from that Penn State defense. Keep everybody in front of you, really focus on stopping that ground game. Don't allow as many big plays, and that should put you in a position to do some good things.
This is a guy that can create. Containing him, I think, is very important. When you have an opportunity to get the sack. He has been a really impressive creator in using those legs. I know he's got 8 touchdowns in the last couple of years, and he can do some things, move the first down marker and with his legs. But what really scares you, I think, as a defense, and what Manny Diaz is probably concerned about, is just containing him within that pocket, because when he's able to evade pressure and able to keep his eyes downfield, he's got the weapons. I mean, he's got 4 guys who have at least 24 receptions. Roman Wilson is tied with Marvin Harrison Jr. for the most touchdown catches in the Big Ten with 10 of them. And he's got another standout tight end, which they always seem to have in there. They actually have a couple of them between Colston Loveland and then A.J. Barner, who used to be at Indiana. So I think that's a differentiating factor right here than any other quarterback they face. I think they faced some good quarterbacks. They had a good one last week, but this is a quarterback who, when it does fall apart a little bit and he's forced to create and looks downfield, there's a lot of weapons and guys who have done it before. So that scares you a bit. And let's dive into it with players to watch. I think we've already talked about 20 different players that will be focused in on in Beaver Stadium, Daniel. But when it comes to Penn State, maybe a name that we haven't focused in on yet, who is that player for you?
Yeah, I wrote down one and we did not touch on it, and I'm very happy about that, because I was a little worried about getting to this segment. But I went with Alex Felkins, the kicker, grad transfer from Columbia. He's really added some stability to special teams for Penn State after Sanders Sahedek's shakiness in the opener against West Virginia. I always think back to that 2021 game that Penn State lost 21-17 on that late touchdown pass to Eric Hall. I mean, in that game, Jordan Stout missed a 43-yard field goal, and then Penn State elected to try a fake field goal down near the goal line. And that Penn State basically left 6 points out there, and you lose a game by 4 points. I think that this game is going to come down to the margins. I really like this Michigan defense. I think it's a very stout unit. No matter who they've played, you can only play who's on your schedule, and Michigan's doing what they're supposed to be doing. So I think that we're going to end up in some situations where we could see Alex Felkins have to take some of these long field goals. We could see a Penn State drive sputter out deeper into the red zone, and it's not really close enough where you can run the T out there and get that 1 yard. So I think that Felkins is someone that we're going to see a lot of on Saturday. And I think that he's someone that really can't afford to leave any points out there on the field, because you're going to need to get everything you can against this Michigan team.
Excellent pick there. He's been a real bright spot for them. Mark, where are you landing here?
I'm going to go with Zane Durant as somebody who's kind of represents that entire group of defensive tackles. I mean, he to me has been the most consistent of those D tackles, and I think a guy who's added weight in a good way, very athletic. Will that mean that Zane Durant is making a ton of tackles? He has 5.5 tackles for loss on the year. I don't think so, but I think a guy like Durant, watch for him to do his job. James Franklin talking about that gap accountability, take up space in that middle, cause whatever havoc you can cause, and allow your linebackers and safeties to make as many tackles as they could possibly make. So I don't know that it's going to be a big numbers game, but keep an eye. If he's playing well, I think that defense is going to be playing well. And again, I mentioned Zane Durant, but I think it's that position as a whole. I think Zane's going to be the key guy, but watch for all of those guys and see how well they play, because I think if they're doing a good job, Penn State's going to be in a really good spot defensively.
In the spirit of your pick, I'm thinking along the same lines. I'm picking Hunter Norzad because I think he represents that interior of the offensive line, and he really does. I mean, you look at the performance collectively against Ohio State. When we have to note that JB Nelson did not play, was considered available on an emergency basis, but the interior performance was lacking in that matchup. And you look at some of the grades that get doled out by Pro Football Focus, whatever you make of those, the metrics. Hunter Norzad's numbers really plummeted in that matchup. But I think what was startling was some of the miscommunication issues that day against Indiana. We saw a much more buttoned up approach offensively, and that included the offensive front at Maryland. But the miscommunication issues will damn them in this matchup, I think, because they're going to result in 2 or 3 yard the losses in the ground game, or Drew Aller getting hit and potentially losing control of the football. But either way, putting your offense in bad third down situations, and that's a main theme on Saturdays, avoiding those kind of spots, or in positions where you could lose the ball because of an early hit after the handoff, or Drew Aller's getting hit in the pocket. Kenneth Grant, Chris Jenkins, these guys in the interior, you don't mess around with these guys. They might be the best defensive tackle tandem that we've seen thus far face Penn State. We've seen some really virtuoso performances individually on the defensive line against the Nittany Lions. This tandem, the way they're playing right now, it's a major concern when you look at the matchup. And so Hunter Norzad at the center of this, is not just about watching number 64 push around defensive linemen and move them downfield physically. It's about those pre-snap moments, something that Juice Scruggs seemed to handle so well. His teammates will tell you he's handling that really well, but I think it will be pretty stark. I should say it'll be pretty obvious if the miscommunication issues happen, because Michigan will make you pay for them with the athleticism, just the brutality they have up front, and they're a well-coached bunch. And so I think it's going to be very obvious from the early on of this matchup where things are heading, and it's going to be based offensively on that interior. So I'm going with Hunter Norzad, the starting center for the Nittany Lions. It's time for predictions, fellas. We're going to lead off with Mark, get to Daniel. I'll wrap us up, but we've got Michigan, we've got Penn State, and I'm going to put it out there. None of us have picked against Penn State on this podcast for a game. I think you got to go back to last year's Ohio State game. So October of 2022, we've picked Penn State the rest of the way. We all had them winning the Rose Bowl. We all had them beating Ohio State in Columbus. And Mark Brennan, with that, I hand the mic to you.
Well, first of all, I want to say that this is a serious podcast when we're talking about players to watch and we pick a kicker, a defensive tackle, and a center. I mean, this is a football podcast, right? I mean, we're not talking about quarterbacks and receivers and running backs and linebackers. We're getting in there to the nitty-gritty of this thing. So just wanted to leave that out there. But in terms of predictions, listen, I said this in the written version. I think we could analyze this all we want to, but at the end of the day, this Penn State team hasn't beaten a Big Ten opponent that's ranked in the top 10 since the Big Ten title game in 2016, since it beat Wisconsin. It invariably finds a way to lose, or lets the opponent, just can't get it done. And there's been so many close games. And sooner or later, I mean, that kind of becomes who you are. And I'm to the point now, we all picked Penn State against Ohio State, and I thought the defense played well enough and the special teams played well enough to win, but the offense let it down. I just can't pick this team to win this kind of game until I see it. I really can't. And I know that's a cop-out, but that's what I'm going with. So I'm picking Michigan close. Penn State covers 24-21 Michigan. And in terms of a bold prediction, I had a different one, but then somebody picked over it. So I am going with Katron Allen. Not going to score a rushing TD in this game, but he is going to score. He is going to catch a TD pass. So I think they may get down there in that red zone, and Michigan's going to get all the defense in there to try to stuff that run. And I think they'd maybe do a little play action or something, and Katron kind of leaks out, and Allers kind of is able to dump a pass. And we've seen him try it a couple times this year. Hasn't quite worked, but I think that's something that could be there for them. And I would watch for Katron Allen to score his first receiving touchdown of the season and only the second receiving touchdown of his career.
All right, Daniel, you heard it from Mark. He's got Michigan coming out with the win from Beaver Stadium. Where do you land here?
I think that a lot of things that Mark said about who you are as a team are really true at this point. And I think I've been pretty vocal about different players and different phases of the game being very prove it um, and over the course of this year and needing to see it. But in picking this game, I tried to avoid some of that kind. I didn't want to dismiss Penn State out of hand. I think that this team has done a lot of good things over the course of this year. I think that if they do win on Saturday, it's going to be a real slugfest, and it's not going to be easy. I think that in my final score, I think I factored in about 3 field goals. So I think that there's going to be some frustrations, and I think Penn State is going to need to come through in all 3 phases. I picked Penn State to win here. Before the season, I picked Penn State to go 11-1 with the loss in Columbus. I flip flopped on that before the Ohio State game and got burned. I don't want to flip flop on my instincts right now. So I'm going to stick with it. I think that when you look at this matchup, and I think that based on how the two teams are playing, that Penn State matches up really nicely when it comes to the running game. And I think that puts the game on JJ McCarthy's arm against this Penn State secondary. And I think I like what the secondary might be able to do. On the other side, and I think that the defense is going to keep things close enough that when the offense, gets points here and there, that it can hold up. And so I went with Penn State 23, Michigan 21. I think it's going to be close. I think it's going to come down to the wire. It's not going to be comfortable at any moment for either team, but I think that Penn State sets itself up to be 11-1 and be in the conversation through for the final 2 weeks of the season. As for my bold prediction, I leaned on the 3 Detroit players, Kalen King, Kobe King, Jalen Reed. Talking to them this week, I think that all 3 of those guys are really focused. Jalen Reed has been playing really good football these past couple of weeks, outside of a couple things in that Indiana game. I think Kobe King has really added some stability for Penn State at the second level. You think back to the linebackers against Michigan last year and how that looked. I think with Kobe King and Abdul Carter taking on bigger roles this year, that's definitely helped calm things down a little bit. And then I think Kalen King is just ready for this type of game. He knows what happened the last time he was in the spotlight, doesn't want that to happen again. So I think between those 3 players, you're going to get at least 3 tackles for loss and at least 2 forced turnovers, whether that's fumbles, interceptions, I don't know, blocked punt, something along those lines. So that's where I finished up with everything.
All right, I'll start with my bold prediction because I almost always feel like I forget it when I finish out the show. So I after those 418 rushing yards against Michigan, major improvement. I think they'll keep Michigan underneath their season rushing average of 167, potentially well underneath that. I think maybe that's a number that Michigan tacks on a bit later in the game, because I do ultimately see Michigan winning this matchup 24-20. Was with what I have for the final pick. Like Daniel and like Mark, I entered this season and predicting 11-1 with a loss at Ohio State and a win against Michigan. Turned against that. Thought I saw enough from Penn State through those first 6 weeks, and thought I didn't see enough from Ohio State to make that pick. It was a game that did hang in the balance, but the offensive performance was just so underwhelming that it left you kind of wondering what this Penn State team is. And so you go through the Indiana game, and that doesn't really get alleviated. And I just feel like I've got to buy a lot of stock into what we saw in College Park to convince myself to pick them to beat this Michigan team, which I want to remind people has won 21 consecutive conference matchups coming into this showdown. And in my mind's eye, when I just think of the collective 9-game image of what this offense is, it's just not good enough to beat this Michigan team, regardless of the game being in Beaver Stadium and regardless of the run defense stepping up and playing its part and having a big bounce back in this matchup. Ultimately, I think that JJ McCarthy will come out of this game as kind of the differentiating factor. And that's not to say Drew Aller is not up to the task of going one-on-one with JJ McCarthy. I just think that the explosive plays have been there for Michigan all season. You can look at a lot of pass efficiency metrics, and the number 1 in the country, you look at those same pass efficiency metrics, and Penn State's out of the top 50. We know they're near the bottom of explosive plays. If we're talking about a down to the wire one or two plays makes the deciding factor between Michigan and Penn State, I'm going to give the odds to the team that has proven they can produce explosive plays, even if Michigan hasn't faced those kind of tests. Because the one time, if we want to talk about how much Michigan hasn't faced tests, well, we saw what happened to Penn State's offense when they did face a test. And it was a very ugly afternoon. And I just can't get there. I thought about it, Daniel. I really did. When I sat down with this prediction, I thought I could get to the finish line and put Penn State on front of the scoreboard, but I just couldn't do it. And the reason is just what we have seen cumulatively to this point. I think they just have to do some things at the best level they've done all season offensively, including finding balance and being the very best version of yourself offensively against this particular defense is just such a huge task. And I just don't see them getting there. So 24-20, Michigan wins, dropping Penn State down to that second loss and then eliminating the college football playoff conversation. And if we're wrong about it, if I'm wrong about it, then Daniel will let us know on the postgame podcast because he will be absolutely 100% correct. And we'll have a much different view of what could await here in November than what I am forecasting. And fellas, over an hour again for our pregame podcast. I think we always plan 45 minutes and do our best to push the limits there. I apologize for that, but it's always a fun conversation with you two. And we'll be back in Beaver Stadium together. If you missed it, these guys were at the basketball season opener earlier in the week. Daniel will be back at basketball. Grace Brennan will be getting photography there as they look to go to 2-0 on Friday. Don't miss our hoops coverage. And before we get out of here, Mark, why don't you tell the people about the deal we have going on? Ignore the promotion scrolling on the bottom of your YouTube page. It's inaccurate. It's not 30% off. It's 50% off. But it does end soon. 50% off VIP annual subscription. And if you watch what's happening on the recruiting front on our site right now, Brian Doan, Steve Wilfong, and of course our guy Tyler Calvaruso, you'll understand why that's so valuable on a week like this.
Yeah, so from what we understand, this could be the biggest turnout of recruits that they've had in recent memory, larger, even or bigger even than whiteout earlier this year, and it makes complete sense. I mean, given the opponent and given the gigantic stage that Penn State's on. So for people who don't realize, a lot of our recruiting coverage is at the VIP level. It really is what helps us pay the bills. And if you want to get in on a really great deal, 50% off for an annual pass. Act quickly because it ends relatively soon. And that comes out to less than 15 cents per day. And that will be worth your while just for the content that comes out of this weekend. You know, Tyler Calvaruso does a great job. Brian Doan and our national staff are just absolutely tremendous, and it's all hands on deck for these kind of recruiting weekends. So this is a great time to come on board. And if you come on for 50% off the annual rate, again, comes out to 15 cents per day. Will take you through next year at this time. And we know a lot of big things happening with Penn State football, recruiting, hoops. And don't forget, we also have a lot of VIP team coverage as well. I mean, the practice report that you guys put together every week is something that I think everybody loves. And, you know, VIP scoop on the boards, the ability to communicate with us or other 24/7 sports people, all of that is part of what you get. And another cool thing, if you're VIP, you get to go to other boards and read their VIP content, which is actually pretty funny when different things are happening at different schools. So you could see the way different communities are kind of reacting. So you can't necessarily post on those VIP boards, but you can see what people are saying. You know, if there's like a school where there's a big like sign stealing scandal or something like that is happening, you could go over and check out what people are having to say about that. But it's a good deal. We're a local business. You're supporting us, and we really appreciate it. For everybody who's already a subscriber, thank you so much. If you're on a full paid subscription plan, make sure that you take advantage of the free Paramount Plus subscription. Great deal. A lot of great programming on Paramount Plus, and we have all sorts of Big Ten sports coming to Paramount Plus over the next couple of years. So that's the pitch.
Get the whole package for half the price. And by the way, December, things get really interesting from a roster standpoint. I hate to say it. I think there's like 16 days left in the season or whatever here, and we got 3 football games to watch, but the portal opens in early December. The early signing period is in December. There's a lot going on that VIP subscribers will be well in the know on that we won't necessarily always cover here on the podcast or with our free content. So good stuff from Daniel and Mark. On behalf of everybody, I'm Tyler Donahue stepping aside for now. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.